The fact value distinction seen through the history of the West. So the Urswant, um, or the primordial site where we can see the beginning of the fact value distinction, is most obviously um, visible in the beginning of Plato's Politeia, where Socrates is achieves this change of soul of the rather placid young interlocutor, who suggests that Dike, or justice, is returning something to the one who is owed, but he is made to see that if the one who does justice, or the lawmaker, um, is set on an analogy with the doctor should be making the patient better and not worse. And as it turns out, to follow the mechanical rule, simply return what is owed, would make someone worse in the case that they were in a deranged state, and you would give them a weapon that they would use to, in the current phrase, to be harmful to themselves or others. Um, so, seeing that, you could say you have gone from the empirical fact of a certain opinion existing, the so-called doxa, which is always, um, for Socrates, mixed up with the material, and stands in contradistinction to the daimon, or to the theos, or the god. Um, the opinion is corrected there in pointing out that contradiction, if that's the right way to put it, or actually in pointing out that something that uh, the young uh, interlocutor granted to be the case. So ad hominem granted to be the case. He said, "This is what I think." Um, he was then placid enough to admit that actually that's not what he thinks, because then he sees his thought in the new light of the case of the deranged person, and he changes. So he has a turn within his soul. Um, it's that turn which is meant to be towards the agathon, or towards this helios of being, the most being, or the most real being. Uh, that that's the first uh, moment, as it were, in the fact value distinction. Then we have a long medieval period, and then we're kind of picked up with Hume making this literary remark that every time I read some guy talking about something, he lists things. There's a man standing, the man dropped a piece of paper. Oh, that man ought to pick up that trash. Um, the He remarks upon this sudden leap from listing things that are, to saying you ought to do this or that. That in itself doesn't mean too much. Uh, it's kind of like he's saying, are these statements really amounting to a cogent argument that they ought to move me to adopt the proposition? Are they good reasons? Are they somehow leading me to something that's is makes sense to me? Which it does, because you would see, like, yeah, that guy dropped some stuff on the ground. It's just, we don't really want trash. Trash is probably inherently irrational, let's say, and so he ought to pick it up. So that's the kind of that's sort of the background of how that gets picked up. Then Kant takes it and he puts it into the terms of Newton. So then he sets Newton's laws, everything Newton's laws can predict against what, um, let's call it understanding, can deal with. So understanding can deal with this notion that trash is unsightly and therefore it ought to be picked up. And therefore, when you go from there's a man standing there, the man crumples a piece of paper, the man drops the piece of paper, the man ought to pick it up. You're doing something that stays with the thing that makes sense, the sensible thing. It stays basically with just this Socratic reasoning, not anything, uh, not wisdom, not anything very imaginative, but just this so-called phronesis, the so-called good sensible thing to do. He ought to tell him that he ought to pick up the trash. So when this goes through Kant, it becomes a foundation statement about uh, scientific method, about what observations should be counted as acceptable, and how should we proceed when we have to decide questions like that. And the answer is given out of basically this Cartesian program that we can certainly take as a foundation, quantifiable measures and things to do with extension, and then you put that in terms of Newton's math, and then you get this statement, as I said, set off against these other kinds of under things that are not obviously external, things which have to do, which are sort of parallel to sort of the understanding, emotion, the quote unquote will, things which are somehow can't be demonstrated to be part of the sense data in an easy way. So you then concede all spatial sense data to kind of Newton. Then you got some other people that totally radically critique that, like Nietzsche. Then you get it mended back together, or quote unquote sanitized, as Leo Strauss says, by simul for the fact for what we now have, which is this fact value distinction that everyone talks about. So you have all kinds of stages from Plato to now, and we're now in a particular settlement on that issue, as it were. But that could change.